In many ways, co-founder matching is like a marriage, right? It requires a relationship. Again, it's easy to say but hard to do. You need to have complementary skills. So each founder brings something special to the table, which is relevant for the business that you're building. And yet, at the same time, they have some shared chemistry or some way of, having a cohesive relationship.
Some conversations don't just inform, they reframe how we see the real work behind innovation. Not just the pitch decks and headlines, but the leadership decisions, family legacies, and invisible team dynamics shaping the real ventures. Welcome to another episode of School to Startup, brought to you by Traction, a private market intelligence platform that's been supporting the global startup ecosystem for over 12 years now. Through our university partnerships, we work with institutions driving innovation and entrepreneurship, and this series highlights the academic leaders making that happen. I'm Harish, your host today, and joining us is Professor Balagopal, Chair of Entrepreneurship and Family Enterprise area at INSEAD, one of the world's top business schools. He's not just an expert in venture leadership and family enterprise, he's someone whose research helps us understand what actually works when founders, investors, and next gen leaders step into complex ecosystem. Professor Bala, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot, Harish, for having me on your show. And I've been with INSEAD for a long time now, but always based out of Singapore campus. So a pleasure to be on your show and happy to take your questions.
Great. So let's kick this off with something light. You have studied founders, investors, and family business for years now. Uh, so tell me this. Three founders walk into a pitch. One uses way too many buzzwords. Another brings his dad as a chief legacy officer. And one says, we are pre-product, but post-vision. Who is getting funded?
I can tell you who's not getting funded. Okay, so definitely the jargon one is probably not a good idea, right? So I'm a big believer in simple communication. So I tell my students, if your grandmother is not able to understand your idea, then you're in trouble. Okay, so simple, effective communication works wonders. And of course, building off a legacy is always good. And I think if you actually step back, who's getting funded? That itself is an interesting question. Because again, the way I think about entrepreneurship, I would rather that you don't get funded by investors, but you get funded by customers. Okay, so there is something to be said about building a solid business, which requires customers to part with their money, because you're solving some real problem or challenge that they face in a way that they find effective. Okay, so to me, the best business is the business that's funded by customers. It may well be that you need to go and raise capital from outsiders in order to grow your business very fast because of compelling reasons, and I can totally understand that. But the starting point is to solve a real customer need, a customer problem effectively. So, that it's easier to so let me just make myself clear. I have the greatest respect for anyone who's able to get anyone else to cut a check for them. Okay? I'm just saying focus first on getting the customer to cut a check.
Right, very interesting. You've also studied how founders build their early teams, especially in those first crucial months, right? So, in your experience, what's harder to recover from? Hiring only your friends or overthinking every decision and never hire at all?
Okay, so you're talking about hiring employees. Okay, let me go one step before that. Think about co-founders, right? So in many ways, co-founder matching is like a marriage, right? It requires a relationship. And it requires, again, it's easy to say but hard to do. You need to have complementary skills. So each founder brings something special to the table, which is relevant for the business that you're building. And yet, at the same time, they have some shared chemistry or some way of, having a cohesive relationship. Because the best way to describe a startup experience is it's like going whitewater rafting. When you want to go whitewater rafting with three other people, you want to be there with others whom you trust because you don't know what's around the corner. Right? So that's kind of the metaphor that I'd like to use. So trying to form co-founding relationships with people with whom you have shared values and chemistry, but you also have complementary expertise. Right? That is the ideal case. That is the gold standard. In reality, it's very hard to get there, right? So oftentimes you end up partnering with friends who know exactly what you know, right? So again, we can't ever wait for the magical perfect match, right? So make sure that you go along with a match that works. Always write a shareholders or a founders agreement. Shareholders agreement comes later, but a simple founders agreement, not with lawyers, but email is good. Just write it down a Word document. That's fine. But it's useful to have those kinds of guardrails in the beginning. And to your point on employees, about who do you hire, I think that comes later. Right? It comes later. I think the first thing, because entrepreneurship very lonely journey. You'd rather co-found, and if so, then you need to make sure that 1 plus 1 is greater than 2.
Right. Very interesting. So, before we deep dive, quick pause for our viewers. If you are enjoying this conversation so far, make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the Traction YouTube channel. And don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode with incredible minds like this one. All right. So you've compared how entrepreneurial leadership plays out in developed versus the emerging markets, right? Are there the traits of the founders matters or the way they use those traits in different contexts matters?
Okay, so you're talking about building a venture in emerging economy like India
Yes,
versus building a venture in the US, let's say in Silicon Valley. Is that what you
correct,
mean?
correct.
No, I think there is something to be said about the process of building a venture, which there will be similarities across the there is something general to be learned about building companies, which will happen across settings. But there is obviously a lot of context specificity that's involved as well, right? So if you are in the US, for example, you have a good example would be the cultural mindsets are very different in the US compared to India, right? Of the kind of people, employees you would get in the valley compared to the employees you would get in an Indian ecosystem like Bangalore. Then you also have challenges which are unique to each ecosystem. So in the US, in Bay Area, you have a very specialized labor market. So you can have your early employees. It's easier then to once you are through with your startup and on to the scale up phase, you can get very specialized human resources to come in who will become your head of sales and head of whatever, who may not be the early employees that grew with you because that is the ecosystem has been around longer. It is not exactly the same thing in India. Right? In India, it's hard to have that kind of differentiated labor market as of now. Things will become different maybe in 10 years, 20 years, and so on. Right? So it is, there's something to be said about the context. But again, the idea of growing your business um, from the start, idea in your head to up and running entity, then from there to some early traction, and from there to more sustained growth. There's a lot of commonality across settings. But because of the way the institutions and the cultures are different, you may find a lot of idiosyncrasies in India compared to the US. So that's kind of so the best way to summarize would be same, same, but different.
Amazing. So now let's talk about family businesses, right? You have spent years working with both first generation founders and next generation scions of legacy entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
So, what's one core leadership trait that helps each of them succeed in their very different roles?
Hmm. It's an interesting question to ask. Firstly, if you look at the idea of first gen founders and later gen scions of family businesses, I study entrepreneurship in emerging economies. When you are studying entrepreneurship in emerging economies, the first gen founder and the later gen family business are like this. They are interconnected. You can't disentangle them. Whereas if you go to America and then you're a scholar who's studying entrepreneurs, you are typically talking about first gen founders. There's a separate community of scholars who study family businesses, and they don't at all look at founders, first gen founders. Okay, that's again, and it's going back to the earlier topic, a very different institutional setting, right? Because in the US, the norm is that, because of very well developed financial markets, you have entrepreneurs who build companies, and typically they have an exit where they do a trade sale, and then they move on to the next idea, for example. And then companies over time, with what started off as family enterprises, have diluted over time and so forth. That's not the case in emerging economies. In where I am sitting here in Singapore, in ASEAN, in India, when we talk about entrepreneurship, we're talking together, first gen founders and later gen family. So if you were to look at what is the big difference, again, I think up until the modern entrepreneurial ecosystem that is diffusing from Silicon Valley into different parts of the world, like China and India, and now Indonesia and Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. Um, Before that came along, if you were lucky enough to be born into the right if you chose your parents wisely, as they say, then
Mhm.
you may have a head start in terms of trying to become a successful entrepreneur yourself. So if you already come from a community which is connected to capital, connected to advice and mentoring, and connected to other businesses and so forth, then it's easier for you to become an entrepreneur. What the modern ecosystem is doing is kind of leveling the playing field. It's allowing anyone who has an entrepreneurial inclination to throw their hat in the ring and go out there and then try to bring their idea to life. They have capital available from angels and VCs and customers and talent who can join them and so forth. So that's kind of the way one can think about the modern ecosystem that is being built in India today. And then the another way to think about so in a way it's leveling the playing field. That's kind of the way I think about it. And another aspect is around what is different between first gen versus later gen. Well, what is it that first gens have in great measure? They have a lot of hunger in the belly. Okay, they have
Interesting.
a lot of
Yeah.
hunger in the belly. Two kids in Koramangala starting something new probably have a lot more hunger in the belly than a giant multinational, some executive working there, and also maybe a family enterprise which has been around, which has always compared themselves to the MNC and saying we are more agile,
Right.
right? But there is someone here who's even more agile, right? So when we think about first gen founders in a place like India, we're talking about more hunger in the belly. But then the next gen family, they also have a lot of strengths. They have um, family legacy. There's a bunch of things they can leverage in terms of assets, tangible and intangible. right? And if that leveraging those assets is combined with a sense of purpose, then I would say the next gen Sions are as good as the first gens, right? So the trick of combining the purpose with the assets of the family, tangible and intangible, which could help compensate, if you will, for having less hunger in the belly.
Interesting. And at INSEAD, you have built and you have also led programs that shape entrepreneurial thinking around the world, right? So, what's one thing you have seen consistently work when trying to prepare students for startup leadership in the real world?
Um, Actually, at INSEAD, we have a our definition of entrepreneurship is like a big picture or a big tent definition. Okay, so let me explain what that means. When we think about entrepreneurship, we think about creating something novel, which involves organizing. Okay. So when we create something novel that involves a high growth potential organization, so you're building some organization that is pursuing a novel opportunity, you can do that as a standalone new venture. That is the classic that comes to our mind. When we think about entrepreneur, we always think about the standalone startup being built by a first gen founder. That is definitely the exemplar, the prototypical way of being entrepreneurial, but it's not the only way.
Right.
Okay, it's not the only way. So if you want to think about being entrepreneurial as doing creating novel businesses, you could do that within existing businesses. Within an existing organization, you can build a new line of business. And there are various labels associated with it, like corporate entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, for example. So that is another way to be entrepreneurial. A- And a third way to be entrepreneurial, and that's very relevant in today's era, is because we are going through a huge demographic change worldwide, right? So entrepreneurship through acquisition is another very important way to be entrepreneurial. So entrepreneurship through acquisition means you as the entrepreneur, you're searching for and acquiring an existing business. So you acquire the business, then you run that business and scale it. Now, is this the sort of scale up that will involve venture capital funding? No, no. Okay. Venture capital looking at hypergrowth, right? This is
Correct.
not that kind of hypergrowth, but very important way to be entrepreneurial and happens a lot. Even in a place like India, you'd imagine that you would expect that India demographically is like, has the age structure of the population is the most interesting in India, right? Very young population. But even in India, there are plenty of family businesses which the founders or the next gens or the current now gens, if you will, want to shut it down because their children are not interested in pursuing that enterprise. And so there's a good market now for entrepreneurship through acquisition, even in a place like India, with a much younger demographic profile. In Europe, it's very active. Right? Europe is very active. So that's a yet another way to be entrepreneurial. You could also rejuvenate your family business completely. Right? Think about it as I have some colleagues who talk about how to disrupt yourself. Okay, they have a nice methodology called the Phoenix Encounter method, and in fact, we are working on applying that Phoenix Encounter method to family businesses because often the next gen who's coming into the family business, one of the big challenges is how do you step away? How do you become your own man or woman? Because the big challenge is that you are always in the shadow of the the wise gen and the now gen, if you will. If it's right,
Yes.
you're going to always be in the shadow of these seniors who have done things, been there, done that. How do you step out of that? And transforming and renewing the family business could be a way to do that, right? So that's an entrepreneurial act, turning around an existing organization. Similarly, joining a company during the scale up phase, we talked earlier about the specialized labor markets. Now, it's common in the Bay Area, but it will become common even in a place like Bangalore and so forth, and Gurgaon, where you can be the person who takes the company not from 0 to 1 or 1 to 10, but from 10 to 100, right?
Yes.
So those are again entrepreneurial acts because you've done some meaningful transformation of the organization. So those are all ways to be entrepreneurial. So when we think about entrepreneurial leadership, we have this very broad view, and it's
Correct.
not like one size fits all. Different people have different risk preferences and different situational circumstances, so they should be able to figure out what works for them.
Very true. I have a quick fire round. You can only pick one for the rest of your life, right? What would you pick? Teaching, research, advising startup, or becoming the most quoted professor on, Instagram, uh, social media memes?
Okay, definitely is research.
Okay. Great. So, coming back to the campus for your students and also for young founders or anyone just starting to explore entrepreneurship, what advice would you offer to help them navigate the noise and trust their own path?
Well, actually, bec becoming an entrepreneur in whichever way you think about, right? Uh, Given the diverse ways we can be entrepreneurial, becoming an entrepreneur is a very personal decision. So there's no right time to do it. And the last thing I want for example, in INSEAD is to somehow create a culture that it's cool to be an entrepreneur. I don't think that's a good idea at all. So in terms of what advice to give, firstly, it's a very personal decision. You have to feel ready to do it. So if you take the example of, I want to become the classic entrepreneur, I want to start a company on my own, de novo startup. Great. But you should be doing it when you're ready to do it, not feel compelled because of the culture of the place you're in and so forth. And then you should go in with your eyes wide open, understand the risks, because starting a de novo venture is the success rate is low. When you think about the transition from having an idea in your head to an up and running business with some revenue, well, that transition is the first transition. There's a lot of different research, but the number I like to quote is that's about a transition rate of about one third. Okay, about a third of companies or a third of founders with ideas in their heads, only a third of them are able to convert that into an actual operating entity. But then 5 years later, if you go and see, probably 10% of that one third are still around. So, which means a much lower transition rate. If you think about it from 0 to 5, talking about like roughly 3%. Very few of them will get angel funded, VC funded, and the ones that have an exit are, you know, really extreme right tail events. So know those risks very clearly, and then prepare yourself accordingly. Right? So preparation matters a great deal. So preparing yourself would mean, I don't know, people say this colloquially, right? Make your mistakes with other people's money, right?
Mhm.
So, I mean, that is just there's some truth to that, right? Picking up experience, um, uh, ho- how to become an entrepreneur. The advice I give is try your best to build something from nothing. As an employee, whenever you get a chance to build something from nothing, grab it. It could be a new product line, new geography, new whatever, just take it. Because in the process of building something from nothing, you will learn the skills that are needed to build a company.
Right.
If you don't at all get that chance, and if you're an engineer, try and go into a situation where you're selling something. Because sales is a very noble thing to do, very hard, but it's a noble profession. Right? So learn selling. Even if you can't get into selling, then get into a situation where you are actually hiring someone to join your team. Because these are things that you need to do as an entrepreneur. You need to constantly be persuading customers, potential customers to buy your product, potential employees to join you, potential investors to give you money, potential alliance partners to partner with you. So you really need to learn those skills. And the best way to learn them is to create something from nothing in your current job as an employee.
Amazing. And finally, where can our viewers follow your work, read your research, and pick up any recent works or case studies you have published?
Um, you can just look at my INSEAD website is the best place. I'm not on social media, so unfortunately, I don't talk about my current latest research. But generally, on the INSEAD website, you will have access to my work.
Perfect. The link will be available in the comment section. You can click on the link and connect with Professor Bala. Professor Bala, thank you so much for being part of this episode. This conversation gave us an insight look into what really drives entrepreneurial success across founders, family businesses, and global ecosystem. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Thank you, Harish. Thanks for having me. I hope your readers, viewers enjoyed what I said, and happy to keep the conversation going.
Definitely. Thank you very much. And viewers, thank you for watching. Today, we explored how entrepreneurial leadership evolves across startups, legacy organizations, and emerging markets. You can find more Professor Bala's work at INSEAD.edu. The link is in the comment section. If this episode sparked something for you, like, comment, subscribe to the Traction YouTube channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a future conversation. See you in the next time on School to Startup.